And a very warm welcome. You're joining us at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24, a special edition, of course, as Budget 2023, the first budget of President Ranil Wickremesinghe in his capacity as Finance Minister, presented in Parliament this afternoon on the theme Sri Lanka towards a new beginning. But tonight we will be talking about recovering from crisis, regaining stability. Let me very quickly introduce an eminent panel who's joining us tonight. And first, Dr. NANDALAL WEERASINGHE, Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. A very warm welcome to you, Ayubowan. We also have with us Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana, Secretary to the Treasury, joining us tonight. Warm welcome, Ayubowan. And we have with us Mr. Sujiva Rajapaksa, Managing Partner of BDO Partners. Ayubowan, welcome to Hyde Park. And last but not least, we have with us Ms. Tanya Abesundara, President of the Ceylon United Business Alliance. Ayubowan, welcome to the show.
NANDALAL.
Mr. Rajapaksa, first, I think we should thank BDO Partners for bringing together the panel. Central Bank Governor, his first post-budget discussion, I think. So thank you for that. First of all, let me start off talking about Budget 2023. We've been discussing about how the government intends to go forward, what economic policies, monetary, fiscal policies that the government intends to bring forth in order to put the economy on track. Central Bank Governor, I think you have been involved. You're a career central banker. Upon retirement, you're brought back as Central Bank Governor, and here you are together with all other officials presenting Budget 2023. And this budget, we as journalists, as viewers, we see that there's something different here. You're looking forward. We're talking about 2045 and beyond. So what factors have you put together in formulating the policies forward?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this discussion. I think from the point of view of the theme of what you exactly, explained quite rightly, regaining stability and the recovery. So that's the important one. When you look at from the overall macro point of view, what we have been trying to basically since the eruption of crisis from the beginning of this year, there are several steps. We have to look at what are the short-term measures that would regain stability, overall macroeconomic stability. And the second step is to recover the economy to a more medium to long-term growth path. Those are two parts. The priority is to first, in the crisis situation, regain the stability. For that, they already started and implemented several measures. For example, if I explain, right from the beginning, at the beginning of this year, from March, government basically made a request from the IMF for a stabilization package. That was the first step. Then in April, once I took over the office, we took several other measures in terms of tightening monetary policy, seeing that inflation is going to go up to this level as a result of loose monetary policy we had, and also announced what they call debt standstill, which it was obvious that we are going into a debt crisis. So those are the short-term measures from the central bank side to regain stability in the short term. And at the same time, the Minister of Finance from the fiscal policy side, they also introduced several short-term measures, not within this budget, but in the interim budget and before, because one of the key fundamental imbalances we had this economy for a long period is a fiscal imbalance. For that, the short-term stabilization measures included the earlier tax package that was introduced back in May, and then in the interim budget, some tax measures. And this is the basically today budget is basically for 2023 and beyond. This is why when you look at this budget, you don't see a traditional, conventional measures that you would normally see in a budget. But the short-term stabilization measures, government and the central bank have already implemented several short-term stabilization measures. As a result, this is why the situation now we see compared to 3-4 months ago, we have seen a significant improvement compared to where we were in terms of the availability of essentials, in terms of even inflation. Now we have seen it going weak, and now it is turning around. And obviously from the government point of view, the tax collections that last year had very lowest tax rate. As a result, government introduced several measures. Now we see tax revenues are also increasing. So that we have to look at this overall policy package and look at what are the priorities. And priorities were at the beginning to stabilize the short-term the economic imbalances. And now we see the results of those things. And what we expect the next piece of that move is to for us to get the what we call financing assurances and get a relief from our creditors for complete our debt restructuring process. So because this is why you don't see a lot of those things talked about in this budget, because those have already been implemented and in the process of completing, and we are moving that process. So this budget basically make the foundation after we basically regain the stability in the short term. Then what next? Then the next steps are basically how we can enhance growth of this country, how we can find out new areas for growth, what are the bottlenecks in each area for us to go for a higher growth path. I think when you look at, that's why we call it 2023 budget. So it's no point of talking same thing that we talk about stability point of view. Now we are talking about from the government point of view. The budget is all about how we can address other macroeconomic imbalances, what are the structural reforms that we have to implement to enhance our capacity to grow in next 3-4 years beyond at a more sustainable basis. This is all about this. This is where I would like to see this as a overall policy package. This is one of the important steps for us to recover the economy medium to long term, while we are already taking measures to regain the stability in the short term.
Right. I'd like to turn to Treasury Secretary Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana here. I know it has been a tough few days for you, sleepless nights, and you're very tired, but thank you very much for being a part of the panel. We'd like to discuss the fiscal reforms that are planned ahead. You have more than 3 decades of experience as a banker, central banker, and you've seen many budgets come and go being introduced. But this time around, how would you introduce the budget, the features of this budget to address the reforms and the challenges, reforms needed and the challenges we encounter in terms of fiscal, public finances and fiscal management?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. As you very correctly indicated, one of the major challenges that the country is facing is to address this fiscal situation. In fact, if you go through the history, maybe last 10, 20, 25 years, the budget deficit and the way it was financed is the root cause of many of the issues that we are facing in the macroeconomy. So it is imperative that you address that root cause. But unfortunately, the avenues that you have to address is very limited. Now the country is going through a very deep crisis. At the same time, from the fiscal policy side, the government revenue had been declined to one of the lowest level, which is one of the lowest in the world as well, about 8.3% of GDP. And at the same time, there had not been any reduction in the expenditure due to various reasons. So budget deficit was hovering around 10-11%. And at the same time, we have lost the access to international markets, and the ability to borrow from the domestic market is also relatively limited. So, and at the same time, the government had to resort to the central bank for financing. So these are the kind of issues that we had to face at the very first stage. That's why in the very first stage of responding to this crisis, that there was some new proposals implemented somewhere in May, particularly in terms of changing the revenue system in the country, particularly the taxation system. And then it was followed by the interim budget that was submitted in August, that also contained a number of measures to particularly increase the revenue and also the reduction of the expenditure as well. and to address other issues. For example, the state-owned reforms. State-owned enterprises have been, one of the sources to some of the pressures that the budget is facing right now. So addressing that also was a very important requirement. So that also addressed. And this budget, what the government has done is to basically prepare a path which could consolidate the measures that we have already implemented, and also to strengthen the fiscal situation in the country while creating an environment where the economic activities would be taking place. The situation right now, because the many of the businesses are suffering and a lot of other issues are there. So amidst these issues, how you basically address this issue is the very, very important challenge. And it is not the kind of, overnight or very short-term effort. You have to have some medium to long-term view on that. So the Honorable President himself has taken that view and presented this budget to basically consolidate the fiscal sector issues, and at the same time to try and implement reforms that would enable the economic activities to take place, and not immediately in this year or maybe next year, in the medium term. So the idea is to basically create that environment right now, so that once we are coming out of this crisis, so we will have an environment where the economic activities would be facilitated. And some of the reforms were long due reforms. Due to various reasons, unfortunately, we had not implemented those. Now at least this crisis has given us an opportunity to implement those much needed but delayed reforms. So that's the important factor that I see in this particular budget. And the next step would be to implement many of these reforms and also the measures. Already I would like to say that the measures that we proposed in interim budget is being implemented now, and we are very closely monitoring, and we have a very strong mechanism also internally in the Treasury, at least to have a look at this. And most importantly, this budget has proposed a presidential task force to follow up the implementation of these budget proposals. In the past, we have seen very good proposals, but unfortunately, some of them were not implemented. Now, the Ministry of Finance and the government are very serious that we have to have a very strong follow-up so that we would be able to implement these policies to get the desired outcome.
Right. I'd like to also turn to Mr. Sujiva Rajapaksa. You too have over 3 decades of experience, but here in taxation consultancy services in terms of tax policy. We'd like to talk about the taxation side of the aspect. Through the interim budget, I think we had a hint of what it is going to be like for the country, whether it's individual or corporates. What's your overall analysis of the tax policy undertaken by the government through this budget, looking ahead and also in line with the reforms and the challenges that the Governor and the Treasury Secretary has very clearly outlined?
Thank you, INDEEWARI, and also on behalf of BDO, let me thank Governor ST and Tanya for being here. And this is, I believe, the 4th consecutive year that BDO and Derana have been basically organizing just after a couple of hours after the budget was presented before the Parliament by the Honourable Finance Minister. Looking at this, INDEEWARI, what we need to understand here is I believe we can't go by sentiments. We need to go by principles here, because it's in a way bitter kind of experience when you increase income tax or pay or whatever, VAT and all that. But needless to say, as Governor said, GDP to the tax have been around 8%, I believe, a couple of years ago, but we should have been at least 15%. So that is why government has taken bold kind of decisions to increase all these tax thresholds through Inland Revenue Amendment Bill. Still it is in the bill form. I think that's going to be enacted one of these days. Through every citizen of this country, I believe, as a tax practitioner and the consultant, I believe that I must tell every citizen of this country have to look at positively. So if not it's a question of how are you going to increase government revenue, how are you going to finance the large number of areas, especially including it could be your education, it could be your health, it could be your government servant salaries, and unfortunately of whatever it is, we have large amount of pensioners here, and like infrastructure developments there, you need money. So there are two ways. I think these two gentlemen, they are the responsible people. Either you print money or you collect revenue by way of taxes. So that's how we have to do it. But I'm a firm believer of paying tax. For me, I like to pay tax. But we need to make sure those tax, every cent is basically utilized for a worthy cause. So that transparency has to be maintained. I'm sure that I'm very happy when I read these budget proposals. There are a fairly large number of proposals discussing about the digital sphere, digitization of processes in most of the places. And also there's one proposal that Inland Revenue, Customs and Excise Department, 3 will have to get together. I think all this time we didn't have that. It was there, but unfortunately it was not implemented up to the expected levels. Now, Inland Revenue, if you take, there is a RAMI system, that is revenue management system, but there are a lot of issues with that. I think those things will have to be addressed. In the meantime, this budget proposal encourages, or rather in a way discourages, to use cash, currency. Right. So then it will be very easy, I believe, Westy, for anybody to capture those transactions. I think again the key here is implementation. Okay. If you could implement these things properly, as ST said, there's going to be a presidential task force going to be set up to make sure that everything is implemented, and then I am sure that there will be a kind of, everyone will be happy. But again, coming back to the other area, there are no salary increases and no any other concessions given here. But we all citizens of this country need to understand it will be very hard for any government to give so much of concessions, but those we have enjoyed some years ago for a longer period. But now it's a time that we all will have to tighten our belts and make sure that you continue with the same momentum, at least for maybe next couple of years.
Right. May I turn to Ms. Tanya Abesundara, Ceylon United Business Alliance's president. You speak of small and medium scale enterprises. Amid challenges that this segment of the economy has faced through the Easter Sunday attacks, to the COVID prolonged lockdown period of the pandemic and the economic crisis as well, how do you assess the focus and the reforms that have been brought to address challenges faced by the SMEs?
Thank you, INDEEWARI, and I would thank the distinguished panel here. Thanks for inviting me. To be very honest, I think this budget itself is a great budget, but my question here would be, is it a doable budget with the current economical situation? That is a huge question mark. I mean, though the budget itself looks very beautifully, very transparent, and there are lots of systems being put in where it should have been done long years ago, where it has not been done, and then, but it's better late than never. But at the moment, with all the taxations and the lending, I mean, implemented through the central bank, like most of the economics in the world, this is an easy way out. But is it precedented or is it volatile? No, I believe it is not volatile for an economy of our magnitude, because we are suffered a lot. The private sector, the SME, has suffered a long span of downs more than ups. So at the moment, with this sort of situation what has been arising in the country, by implementations of this nature to a longer run, I believe it is not sustainable, because I mean, trying to curtail the inflation will rise in a huge credit. I mean, by trying to work, we are just curtailing it. I mean, long-term policies are being put, but first we have to address the short-term issues, what we have been facing. So this will create a credit demand, and due to the high interest lending where the private sector is faced, and we find it very difficult to sustain our organizations. So in the longer run, I mean, like the budget itself is very great. I mean, how are we going to, where are we going to collect this liquidity to finance the budget? If the private sector keeps collapsing at the rate it would, then what is going to happen is, will this be a doable budget? But of course, what the president has spoken about, what happened in the past and the transparency he's promising, it is beautiful. I mean, what he is trying to implement, it is great. But before implementation, people got to survive. I mean, looking at the budget itself, it's not the solution. But here, the bigger, wider picture is to sustain the economy, to go in for a future. So if the economy is not being sustained, if the economy is not being protected, how are we going to look at the wider picture? Because the private sector, the industries, the SMVs has to be protected. But right now, with what is happening around, the lending rates going high tremendously, not in a stable position. And then there have been taxes that have been implemented. We don't know where these taxes are heading to. The transparency of the taxes not been shown. Of course, where the president is promising now the transparency, we believe it's a great step. But all these implementations are great, but are they doable? But for me, as a private entity, I believe the government itself should look at the wider picture and put some sort of breathing space for the private sector to uphold their businesses. If the private sector does not uphold their businesses, these taxations can't be collected in INDEEWARI. Where are we going to collect these taxes? End of the day, it has to be collected from the private sector. If the private sector happens to fall, I mean, this beautiful budget will fall. I mean, where the president is trying to, I mean, develop the nation, long-term policies are being given, long-term policies are being promised. I mean, a lot of transparency is being promised. All this is great, but these should be done step by step. I mean, you cannot kill an economy just to sustain a white elephant.
I'd like to turn to Governor as well as Treasury Secretary here. I think I will try to minimize the time spent on asking questions and have one general question to all of you. Now, there is a question of whether this budget is doable, whether the implementation will be overseen at its best. But you did mention, Governor, that we are trying to address short to mid-term challenges while looking ahead at a long-term vision for the economy. But again, if you may elaborate, these short-term challenges, we're talking about a credit crunch, we're talking about a foreign currency dearth, we're also talking about people, as we discussed just now, who are trying to make ends meet. So what of these reforms will immediately benefit and trickle down to not just the people, but also the businesses, the engine of the economy, the engine of growth?
Yeah, I think that's a good question in response to what Tanya also mentioned. Let me deal with what I think from the interest rate and inflation point of view. I think he will deal with the taxation part. So when we look at the phase economy is now going through, is a current crisis and contraction of the economy has already happened. Basically, that has happened as a result of certain policies that we had in the past. So now what is happening now is basically already happened. So what is the choice now? Choice for us is to how fast we can get out of this crisis. So it's not that we don't have time to wait until giving some space, giving some time to recover economy. If you delay what we have been doing, it will delay the process of recovery longer. It will delay the ability for the government to implement collect all taxes going forward. So this is where the decisions we have to make it quick. We have to make before economy going even further deeper into the crisis. So what we have been doing so far is to prevent economy crashing and then collecting pieces and resurrecting. This is not what has happened. Basically, this kind of soft landing. Economy was anyway going to crash. So prevent the economy crashing, obviously, we had to slow down the path that economy was going down. And we had to slow the path the way that inflation was rising. And inflation went up to 100%. This economy was going to crash without a soft landing. Then we wouldn't be here to discuss even what we are talking now. So compare the situation at the beginning of the crisis, where we were about 3-4 months ago. We are seeing the 12 hours of power cuts. We are seeing the long queues of all these things. And the priority at that point, and we already saw inflation was rising. We saw the currency exchange was running just like let the kite goes up, and without any control, currency was depreciation. So look at the situation where we were. So the best thing that we could do at this point to prevent a crash landing, things that we did were in fact necessary. There's no other choice. If we did not do that, if we did not tighten the monetary policy, if we did not raise interest rates, and if the government did not raise taxes, and if we continue say, okay, we need some more time, go it slow, then we would have seen inflation already above 100%. Then these SMEs, none of them would survive. Already all had crashed down. I'm not saying now they are better. Obviously, when country is going through this crisis, there has to be a pain going through. What we have to do is to do the minimum necessary to minimize the pain and stabilize the economy and recover on a long-term basis. So if we didn't do that, then we would be in a different situation. We would have been in a different situation if we did not do that. That is why, look at the positive results of what we have done so far. All the SMEs, I think my question I'm asking, 3-4 months ago, when we had this kind of situation, were the SME operating better than how they operate now? Did they have sufficient petrol, diesel, energy, gas, all these things? Did they have sufficient electricity to at least for them to operate on a basic way? So let's say they had the low interest rates. Even if you had 5% interest, that kind of situation, would any SMU, any business, would that be able to survive? So now we are in a situation compared to where we were as a result of those measures that we have taken. Now there is, it's not 100%, but there has been a space that at minimum level, at least some businesses, social businesses, those are earning foreign exchange, thanks to Barcelona crisis, they are basically operating. But obviously there are certain sectors that has been affected. There's no question about that. But if we did not do that, even exports, even none of these sectors would be able to operate. You would see, like what happened in Lebanon, 23-hour power cuts, no one would be able to do this. A lot of people will be closing down their businesses. So now we are in a situation of gradual recovering and stabilizing. So this is where, how I see, for the people who are asking, we would have done in a different way. The question is, what is that different way? Please tell us how we could have done better than what we have done so far to stabilize the situation. So this budget is all about, once we come into recovery, then how we can stabilize the economy, recover going forward next year. Because this is a crisis, it is not a result of last 6 months, 1 year. It's more than 2-3 years, something that triggered the crisis, and even longer term imbalances that was creating, instability creating the economy. So when this kind of a long-term structural issues, long-term imbalances, no one can expect economy to recover in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. It's a miracle. I think there's no other choice. And this is the only best way that one can recover. If there any other way, I'd like to listen.
Treasury Secretary, I think you might also have something to add to this question, while also addressing whether segments of the economy, the SMEs to corporates to other industries, whether they're protected. What more can be done in terms of reforming policy to ensure that these entities are protected?
Yeah, I think one thing that Sujiva mentioned, that the limited ability of the government to provide some concessions due to its already large expenditure, the budget, particularly as a result of 1.4 million employees and a relatively high amount of interest payments and various other expenditures, that itself limits the government's ability and limits the space to react this sort of very severe crisis. That's number one. And from the other side, if the government is not going to raise taxes and not going to collect the revenues, and then how we basically manage this situation. I totally agree with Tania saying that whether we are basically only collecting taxes from the private sector. No, it's not the case. Because whether you like it or not, we have these expenses in the government budget which have been accumulated over the years. So that's why we basically in our day-to-day language say that there's a lead time that you can get the revenues, and at the same time the way that you can address some of these issues. So my very pertinent question is that if we are not going to get these taxes, how we are going to finance these other operations of the government? The most important and example that I can cite is the central bank financing. In fact, sometimes we hear there are articles and people are basically blaming the central bank, that central bank is printing money. In fact, it is not the central bank, it is the Ministry of Finance or the government asking from the central bank to print money. Why? Because government is not getting enough money or enough resources to meet its expenses, day-to-day expenses, plus also debt service and related other expenses. So how you basically break this, right? On one hand, if you continue with this money printing, obviously there will be inflation going forward. But at the same time, if you are going to taxes the people, there will be some implications, as Tania was mentioning. And I understand the situation. It's not an easy task for the people to pay taxes as well, particularly the private sector and SMEs and various other entities, plus the individuals. But remember, we are in a crisis. We are in a huge, deep crisis. So if we are not basically introducing this sort of policies to at least to get some amount of revenue and to try the financing that we are going to get from the central bank, the situation is going to be much, much dire. And on the other hand, when you are trying to reduce the government expenditures, you can't do it overnight. You have to implement policies gradually. For example, reduction of the 1.4 million employees in the government. It's not an easy task, and you can't send them home overnight. That's why in this particular budget, there's a commission going to be appointed to look into this matter. How you basically streamline this system and you have kind of an optimal system in the country. And that's why President indicated in his budget that this time, this particular budget, there won't be salary increase, but when the things are going to be improved and with this commission and its recommendations going to be implemented, that request or that situation would be considered going forward, not right now. Why we are not going to implement this sort of salary increases? Because it's unaffordable. It's very difficult to afford. So broadly, the message that I want to highlight here is that it is through these policies and particularly the government's discipline, fiscal discipline, is the only way that I see to find a solution to this, while taking measures to improve the economic performance by taking various growth-promoting measures.
Mr. Sujiva Rajapaksa, we'd like to touch upon state-owned enterprises here as well. We've been talking and we heard President Ranil Wickremesinghe, since he took office, he has been talking about reviving state-owned enterprises, but also ensuring that these enterprises are sustained in such a way that they contribute to the economy rather than being a burden. But do you think we have taken meaningful measures, and these measures are achievable to transform these entities, these debt-deriving entities, into profit-making entities going forward?
Yeah, Indieewari, I'm extremely happy about some of the proposals which have been brought in to manage especially state-owned enterprises, expenditure and things like that. Already ST has, because I'm wearing different hats here. One thing, okay, my, the being managing partner of BDO, as well as I'm chairing one of the largest state-owned banks here. But he has sent quite a number of circulars about curtailing expenditure, restricting certain expenditure and things like that. Not only that, even now it may be a kind of a bitter experience for state-owned enterprise employees, because now pay all this time, through various agreements, and pay has been basically paid by the entity. But now from 1st of January, I believe that have been proposed to discontinue. So as a result, there itself, there will be a huge saving for the that particular entity. If you take my bank, yes, there's going to be a saving. Likewise, there are so many measures have been brought in. Again, one should understand that it's not only the private sector. I'm also from private sector. It's not only the private sector, even public sector pays large amount of taxes. Even I pay, from my bank, I pay at least about 18, I'm talking about billions to government by way of taxes. It could be VAT on financial services, income tax and all the other taxes to the government. So likewise, there are a large amount, a fairly good number of state-owned enterprises who have been basically making large amount of losses. Those things will have to be certainly dealt separately. I believe through these budget proposals, I think the finance minister is committed to look at those. But again, having said that, SLT, Hilton, and a few other institutions, I think they are also going to deal appropriately. Probably it may be end of the day looking at either PPP or privatization of those entities, including Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation. So plus, of course, there are other like Sri Lankan and few other entities also, I think, in the pipeline, which is very important. Otherwise, large amount of money, or all those debts are being basically sitting in state banks. So I think those will have to be certainly, because one fine you have to do it. Right. That is what matters. I think that commitment has to be there. Then everybody will look at. Having said that, again, Indieewari, efficiency of state-owned enterprises is very, very important. I am a firm believer about performance evaluation of everybody, including me being chairman of ST, or should call me and say, look here, show about your performance, maybe by annual performance. If I have not performed, of course you must say why. It's not effectively happening. So then I should be given another couple of months if I don't perform. So you have to resign and go. But that kind of culture we should have. Again, another important point is in the state-owned enterprises, I'm sure that these both gentlemen will understand. For one particular, if you take paddy marketing, there are 2, 3, 4, 5 institutions. Likewise, coconut, there are 2, 3, 4, 5. Why do you want to have those? It can be, all those can be managed by one entity. So those, I believe, reforms are in the pipeline, which is very, very important. So through those reforms, I'm sure there will be fairly substantial amount of money which are going to be saved. That is also something important to note.
There's one more thing I'd like to add to the question about the banking sector and access to finance. This is something we've been talking at length, especially considering the SMEs. And now with, let's say, a triple blow on the economy, Easter Sunday to the crisis, economic crisis, COVID, how do you see the banking sector gearing to support these entities?
See, in fairness to central banks, from the time that the COVID hit Sri Lanka on 15th of March 2020, the various concessions have been given to all the customers, almost all the customers, and the customers also enjoy. But one should understand that any bank is basically banking on liquidity, depositors' money. So banking, so when the depositor comes and demand or asks his deposit, I'm supposed to give that. I can't say, look here, sorry, I have given some money to Tanya, so Tanya will have to give it to me for me to pay a customer. No, I can't do that. So therefore, everyone will have to understand that, because if end of the day, any economy, you must have banking system, sound banking system. If banking system crashes, the whole economy crashes. There are no question about that. So those also will have to be kept in mind when you are looking at, how, and again, now if you take People's Bank, 3 trillion balance sheet, let us say. So I don't even make 1% return on my assets totally. If I get 1% return, I should have 30 billion, which I don't do that. Because we are dealing with cash. There's a huge risk. So that also we need to understand. Sometimes people feel bankers, they are minting money. No, they are not minting money. So there's a huge risk. And especially looking at now, because the moratorium period is over. So there's going to be a non-performing loans piling up. So we are managing with the greatest difficulties. But of course,
But do you think the people who will be taxed and the loans on top of the loans, that they could bear this going forward?
There's a question. As the governor said, now you will have to look at how we are going to do that. But it's going to be a difficult situation for next couple of years. You take now your salary packet in INDEEWARI, now from probably next month, your salary packet is going to be taxed. So but you have obtained loans. You have obtained leases, let us say, for your vehicle. Also, you have gone for 60 months, your credit card staggered payments. I think everyone has gone, including me. So then how am I going to do that? Because my employer will deduct my taxes before I pay all those things.
Right.
Then there's going to be an issue for financial institutions and bankers, because I may not be able to pay my loan. I must go to bank and say, look here, sorry, I don't have money. I don't have disposable income. So those are going to be looked at. In the meantime, we should also rationalize our expenses, which I believe that most of the people are uneasy to do that. So we need to understand, but whether we like it or not, we have to face it. So therefore, when you have certain expenses, look at and see, you prioritize and then maybe curtail certain expenses. It's going to be a tough time. There's no question about that.
I think we've established that it's going to be tough, but it's all in our hands to ensure that we go through this period. We're talking about regaining stability through this crisis. What difference would you have expected in this budget? I think I would post the question that the governor also ended with. What else could the government or the budget have introduced if we are to see these changes and to ensure that people go through this period with resilience?
INDEEWARI, who is the people? People is the consumer. Consumer is the countryman. So end of the day, we are killing the goose that is laid the golden egg. That is the private sector. That is the industries. That is the SMV. Now, end of the day, killing the goose is not going to save the country. I mean, the goose itself is the country, because we are the people who have been, contributing to the country's GDP. We are the people who upholds the economy. We are the people who upholds the government. It's not the public sector. Yes, the public sector is needed for our assistance. We put the public sector over there to assist the nation. That is us called the entity of the entrepreneurs and the business people or the industries. Now, with all these things of what the governor and the finance secretary to everybody is speaking is, yeah, we have to bear the bad times. Why start from the bottom? Why not from the top? Top is the government. We put a government in order, in power to protect the nation. So then protection should come from the top. So, I mean, those measures should be taken from the top. So I'll give you some, I don't know, these solutions are what I believe as a private entity, it's doable. I mean, mainly ceiling and on lending rates are done on advanced economy, and our economy is unfortunately is not financially stable enough to do that. When you seal on interest lending rates, you are killing the business entity. because you are putting up the interest, and we are not in a position at the moment. Yes, it could have been okay if the country suddenly went into inflation, but we have been suffering this stage by stage, from the bomb blast to the pandemic, and then it has come to a position with the greatest difficulty, whatever the industries and whatever the entities called the private sector in whole, where the government is the public, where the nation has upheld and uplifted, not letting the economy fall. Today, the government is talking about, okay, I mean, we need to cut measures, we need to put in regulations and rules because of that. Otherwise, what we were suffering few months ago, electricity cut down, fuel issues, all this suddenly ended. No, it didn't suddenly end. I mean, the reform in nation within a little things would change. So, I mean, what I believe is, at the moment, first thing the government should do is take measures to cut down on the treasury bills. How can the government do this? I mean, stop lending to the government. I mean, to uphold this unproductive public sector at the moment, and these should be privatized if it's not productive. There are so many entities that can be privatized, and by expenditure on what is the central bank or the treasury is being forced to spend liquid cash on these things, is a waste of money. This can be saved, and this can be given into private banking sectors to lend towards the private entities to uphold their businesses. If we were to fall, it is going to be a huge issue. The central bank has to concentrate on the lendings to the government.
So I think I'd like to...
I mean, if this is not controlled, that is, the GSEs are not controlled, we will suffer a huge blowout. Because if that is being controlled to a certain extent, the liquidity that would remain can be dispersed for proper use. And then even in this budget, there are lots of finance that is being adequately left aside for a lot of unnecessary things at the moment. I mean, as usual, even for education, it's only 150 billion. For health, I think it's about 50 billion or 90 billion. But for, to the military, and there is more than 300 billion. So, to protect the nation, there should be a nation. If the country falls, if the government, where are we going to protect? And private sector and the industry is the country, INDEEWARI.
I'd like to turn to the governor here as well, because I think the question is about the central bank taking measures to protect these industries. I'd also like to remind you that we have very limited time live on our post-budget discussion on Budget 2023, Recovering from Crisis, Regaining Stability, in discussion with the central bank governor and our panel of experts joining us. Governor and the panel, I think I wouldn't ask many questions again, but if all of you can contribute to this. We know that the IMF austerity measures are expected. If you can give us a timeline and the progress made, STU as well. If you can talk about what these austerity measures are going to mean for the people, and how with these with the implementation of Budget 2023 and policy reforms that we're talking about, how the economy is going to sustain the challenges, not just of the measures that will be taken, but as well as the trickle-down effect of the war in Ukraine and other tough economic times that even the IMF and the World Bank is predicting for the Western world.
So that's, I think, an important question. I think in terms of austerity measures, we should not get confused by the statements, this is government, private sector, and government is the top, private sector is on the below. I think that's a misconception to me. What is important is, at this point, is to protect the people of this country. So when you protect the people of this country, what is the priority? Who should be protected first in this kind of situation? Who has been affected most? if you look at when inflation is running at 70%, the people who've been affected most are the people who have low-income people, poor and vulnerable. People who are affected most are people who have saved money, pensioners, fixed income earners. Because if their income was 100 last year, 70% inflation is now 30. So they have to live out of 30 rupees compared to 100 rupees last year. So what is the priority for the government and the central bank? Who should be protected? Whether we should let all these people who have been worse affected to continue, they continue to suffer, but we should protect what they so-called private sector industries. Let them perform as they go, and let the poor and vulnerable and savers and pensioners, fixed income people to suffer more. So this is the policy choice. If we had to make this choice before the economy was going to crash, obviously we had space. But unfortunately, we had to deal with this situation when the economy was crashing. So then priority for any responsible central bank or responsible government is the priority is to protect the most vulnerable and poor people and pensioners. This is why I think, why Sujiva said savers should be protected, because their incomes are, real incomes are down. And poor and vulnerable find it difficult to live out of their incomes. They should be supported through social safety nets, the cash transfers, and supported. How they can be supported? They can only be supported if someone, high-income people, top are not the government. Top are the high-income people in the private sector who are earning, making profits and high-earned income. They should be able to contribute more at this point to support the poor and vulnerable. So that's the whole point, why interest rates are high.
Right.
Why these taxes are important. People who earn more should be contribute more. People who don't earn don't have to pay. Then there's an indirect tax. Indirect tax as affecting more to the poor. I mean, then next question, going forward. The next year, obviously, the world economy is going through a even worse year next year. So we have to prepare for that. You know, this year, luckily, world economy has been doing better even than last year because the recovery after COVID. And that is why we are seeing our exports have been performing much better than last year. But next year, we can't expect the same thing. If we don't do things now and prepare for the next year, if our foreign exchange earnings are going to be much lower, then we should be preparing to face that shock also next year. This is why it's important for us to understand why we need to do these things, difficult things now, and what are our priorities, who should be protected. That is the public authority, the government responsible authority. It's a responsibility to protect poor, vulnerable, and most affected people first, and then go to this later. Top ones are the SMEs, private sector, who are earning. Industries, all these people are earning. So they have to make contribution. There's no question. Everyone will have to share the burden. Poor, less. High-income people, higher. So that's basic principle.
We have very limited time to wrap up the show because we have our English news going live. But I think I asked this question from ST, Mr. Rajapaksa and Tanya as well. If you can contribute to going forward, also touching on the import-export sector.
Okay.
You know, now it's important, the Prime Minister clearly stated one thing, economic reforms proposed by the IMF are limited for economic stability. Nothing much, which is very important. One should understand that. So there are so many other fiscal measures and things like that which are not in that. So therefore, one should understand at the moment, you know, what IMF is going to do is, you know, to make sure that they help for our government and the country to have the economic stability only. This is what it says. But I believe that through these proposals, there are a whole heap of proposals, especially not quantitative but qualitative proposals, will make sure if those implemented properly through those mechanisms that are going to be set up, presidential task force and all that, I am sure, you know, then we should be able to get into the government revenue to increase 15% of GDP by 2025, primary surplus more than 2% and things like that. And there are so many other things. Because of the limited time, I may not be able to take you through everything. So those are things I believe that one should understand.
Tanya, you might have something to add.
Yes, I believe, I totally, in a way, agree and disagree with the governor, what he said. For the simple reason, yes, we have to pay the low-income people, we have to pay the pensioners, all that is understood. But like Sujiva mentioned, if the banking sector collapses, the country will collapse. So what I believe is, when I said start from the top, what I said was government service enterprise entities should be cut down. Billions of rupees can be saved. Billions of rupees. This money can be utilized into servicing the pensioners and the low-income people. But killing the SMV, the banking sector will collapse. Then the country would collapse and we would go into a recession in the future.
ST, I think you will have the closing
remarks. To some of the comments made by Tanya. In fact, yes, government is having a relatively high amount of expenditures, but cutting that overnight is very difficult. That's the point that I indicated. And we have taken very carefully, and as Sujo mentioned, we have issued circulars, and we are basically slowly getting there. But you can't reduce that overnight. And also the reforming of SMEs, it's happening. In fact, we have done that, and we have started the process, and there are a number of proposals in this particular budget as well. And one of the other things that she mentioned is that, you know, defense expenditure is something like that, and education is and health is lower than that. If you take the sector as a whole, if you take the health, education, human development, it is the most the sector that get the most amount of resources compared to defense expenditure. I'm not going to talk about the numbers. We will be publishing that. And at the same time social protection, which is about 580 billion compared to 367 to the defense expenditure, pure defense. I'm talking about the Army, Navy, Air Force. It's relatively low, but it again, that expenditure rationalization is an area where the government is concentrated and also taking measures. So to me, it's a combination of these, revenue increases plus expenditure rationalizations that we can, get the deficit reduction going forward. That's where the actions are going to be in the future.
Right. Thank you very much. I wish we had more time to discuss. We had the Central Bank Governor, Dr. NANDALAL WEERASINGHE, joining us, Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana, as well as Mr. Sujiva Rajapaksa, Managing Partner at BDO Sri Lanka, as well as Ms. Tanya Abesundara, the President of Ceylon United Business Alliance, coming to you live at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24, together with BDO partners, to talk about recovering from crisis, regaining stability, as the President presented the 2023 budget in Parliament today. We'll see you again with yet another discussion on budgets going forward, economic recovery. But do stay with us as we come live to you on our AdaDerana English News shortly. Thank you for watching.